Hey guys, it's Trafotin. You know, a common selling point that I hear about this Linux thing is this thing called hardware support, especially for computers with lower configurations, but more so older computers. Obviously, I think people want to hear that Linux is the best thing ever and it's going to solve all of your problems. So instead, let me bring you a different opinion today. Linux can absolutely extend the use of older hardware, but by no means will it make it better or save it. The first thing to get out of the way is security updates. Whether you're using a computer from 14 years ago or a computer from the current generation, it's important to understand security updates, especially at time of purchase. And this is why I think it's important that we need to talk about the ugly truths of end-of-life hardware. While Apple makes it pretty easy to gauge hardware releases and security updates by naming all macOSs after some location in California, on Windows and Linux machines, this can actually be a lot more difficult. Specifically, today I have with me the HP Compact Elite Small Form Factor. Wow, that's a mouthful. Originally, the model that I had came with Windows 7, an Intel Core 2 Duo, and was probably only given to business users because it was Windows 7 Pro. The final firmware update for the HP Compact shipped in 2013, 4 years after its release. Now, one shady thing that both HP and Apple do is they never tell you that you are running a device that has firmware that is not receiving security patches. Now, Windows tries to mitigate this a little bit by auto-updating your hardware, but this doesn't always work, and usually whatever is submitted to Microsoft's registry is usually very out of date. And Apple is even worse in this regard because there is no indication macOS gets updates. The only indication that you know your macOS isn't getting updated is when the updates stop coming. Your hardware needs to be updated frequently, especially if there are really pernicious vulnerabilities against physical hardware. One example of that was earlier this year when Quark's lab found a serious flaw in the TPM 2.0 stack. So if you were using an older version of TPM, or worse, you weren't using TPM at all, you're using TPM, right? You would have been missing numerous security updates related to TPM since then. But it's more than just TPM, because there are attacks out in the wild like LogoFail that exist, which target the UEFI boot stack in your desktop computers or in your laptop computers. And it's important to remember that if you use a computer for sensitive operations that require additional security, things like, banking, for example, handling financial documents, which I hope you would be doing securely, take extreme caution of using older hardware that won't get security updates. If your device is no longer receiving security updates, installing Linux can help as a badness reduction measure, especially if your computer isn't ready to make the step for Windows 11, for example, or for the newest version of macOS, but it won't fix the fact that you're not going to get hardware updates anymore. And when I say badness reduction, it just reduces the harm from an operating system level. You're still getting updates for things that you use on a daily basis, like your browser, your file manager, maybe like LibreOffice or OnlyOffice, but it won't solve the crippling flaws at a hardware level, like if there's a UEFI problem that needs to get patched. Of course, I'd be remiss to talk about this topic without talking about the major selling points of Linux, its performance on lower-end hardware. For example, I have the Asus E403NA, a laptop from 7 years ago, and a laptop with less than 4 gigabytes of RAM. And it's one of the classic 2017 old school Intel Celeron computers, back when Intel still called it Intel Celeron. And it's really important to acknowledge that the weaker a computer is, it's going to limit your options to do specific things. For example, in order to maximize performance on my laptop and give as much resources to the applications as possible, I chose to use the Sway window manager. Not only because it's a Wayland window manager, but because running most other desktop environments can lead to slow performance. Well, it's not that bad, because on the HP Compact, I am able to run GNOME on Ubuntu 24.04 pretty well, And while loading times themselves are pretty slow, you could probably swap out the older hard drive and replace it with something like an SSD. And GNOME is fairly capable at 4 gigabytes of RAM. It's really just slowed down by the older hardware itself. Like, maybe you have older RAM, especially if you have one of the old school spinning hard drives. And as a whole, the HP Compact, despite its age, is still very capable today at just doing general web browsing, heck, even watching YouTube videos. But one of the major problems the HP Compact brings to the modern day is its inability to run specific applications. More specifically, I would say, is to play contemporary video games. Now, understand that I'm probably being a little too optimistic and stress testing this device here. But of course, I like to be thorough and try to run as much possible. But when I was trying to run games on the HP Compact, I just could not get multiple video games to run. Most games would just spit out OpenGL errors or DirectX errors because they wouldn't work at all. For example, the Grim Fandango Remastered encountered errors because it requires OpenGL 3.3 or higher, and the Core 2 Duo only supports up to OpenGL 2.1. But how do I know it only supports up to OpenGL 2.1? Well, my friends, it's because of this thing called MindTest, which nicely tells you what version of OpenGL that you're running at the top, which runs at an average of 20 FPS, which is probably not acceptable given the pixelated state of MindTest. But despite being able to meet every minimum requirement, except for the GPU one, Rebel Galaxy still fails to launch at all, even if you launch it in its DirectX 9 mode. And games like Abzu and Cuphead won't launch because of DirectX 11 compatibility issues, because DirectX 11 doesn't support the Intel Core 2 Duo. Now, of the games that I did get to work, this is maybe optimistic or depressing, depending on how you look at it. The best that I had was Oddworld's Abe's Odyssey, which is still unsuccessful at playing any of its rendered videos, and instead of being able to play the rendered videos, you just get the good old 90s scan lines from, hey, remember those on CRT monitors? Aside from this, though, the game is completely playable despite these downsides, but I wanted to push the hardware a little more. I really wanted to find a game that would work, so I also tried running the original Psychonauts. While not encountering any initial installation issues, the game practically ran at the rate of a slideshow and was basically completely unplayable. Crying. Finally. Some of the old markers have fallen apart. What all of this shows is that older hardware can't keep up with the pace of software. You can't get in on the latest AI craze. You can't do proper developing because compiling your programs is going to take literal hours. And that doesn't mean that the computer is incapable, but there's a serious limitation with what you can or can't do. The other problem is legacy cables. With older computers like the HP Compact, you are effectively forced into specific display cables. For example, I usually use a lot of HDMI cables, but with the HP Compact, the only cables that are supported are VGA and DisplayPort cables. Now, I just so happen to have a pair of VGA cables lying around after years and years of using them, but for older computers, especially when you start getting into the early 2000s, maybe the 90s, you might not exactly have a FireWire cable lying around for that Power Mac G3 of yours. Now, one of the things that I can't stand hearing about aging hardware and probably open source software in general is that a lot of people will tell you that there's a community out there who develops a whole manner of firmware in case you're having trouble. Now, I don't want to downplay projects that are out there because there are projects that do that, especially if you have really common firmware. You know, obviously there's a big community of people on Linux who worship ThinkPads like it's a second coming of Jesus, or you get Microsoft Surface tablets just because they're really problematic in general. And hardware that's actively used, there's definitely a community of people who care about it. Companies have abandoned this software to begin with and are very unsympathetic to people's plight about it. When you visit the Steam pages for some games, you'll notice Steam now gives a warning telling people to start making the move to Windows 10 because Steam only supports supported versions of Windows. Shocker, right? And it's because these companies are very unsympathetic about running software that's no longer supported. And if companies who have tens of people, maybe hundreds of people working on this are unsympathetic to it. You think that a bunch of random hobbyist volunteers are going to be sympathetic to your plight? Unless they're really desperate to run that hardware themselves, or if there's a demand for it, that seems very unlikely to me. But there is a reason why there's a probably minority of people who continue to outcry these deprecation initiatives, and it's because of moving up to the next architectural level might discriminate against people of older hardware. But we have to ask ourselves the question that if these changes and how developers at Canonical, Fedora, and SUSE are responding is an indication of anything, it shows that developers want to move faster, and older hardware support hinders that progress and eats up developer time. I can't imagine a single developer who would volunteer time to discuss these issues online and argue with people about whether or not they're able to use their HP Compact from 2012 in the Lord's year of 2024, rather than spending that time developing on the things that they love and making something better for the world. 32-bit hardware was dropped in many distributions for the same reasons. And as much as I would like to tell us to be able to use computers in the future and not provide any more e-waste to the world, there's a real human cost to the people who have to keep these older architectures running or keep bits of software backwards compatible to legacy hardware or computers. You have to think about it this way. If you're still using a computer that no longer gets security updates, that a manufacturer doesn't support, and maybe it's a 32-bit computer, God forbid a PowerPC computer, this cycle can't go on forever. Now, obviously, there's going to be extenuating circumstances to this whole thing, because, maybe you might not have money for a new computer, maybe you live in a developing country, maybe it's just what you have and you're not able to get another one because of access or trade in your country. There's a whole host of reasons why you might be using hardware that's no longer supported, or you're using the hardware that you are. But if you're sick of using hardware that's not supported, there's going to become a threshold where the problems become problems not just for the hardware makers, those problems are going to translate to problems for you. And maybe, just maybe, it's probably the time to support hardware makers that give their product a long shelf life and give you the right to repair in the process. Now let's get into an issue that I think most people don't think about, and that's the environment. My favorite excuse is using an old machine will save the environment. But especially in case of older desktop computers like the HP Compact, or if your computer has aging batteries, I would argue that the continued use of older computers isn't just bad for the environment, it's actually actively worse compared to other alternatives. Now, I know I'm pushing the HP Compact by saying it's lacking in its gaming capabilities, but it is really competent at word processing, general web browsing, or just some basic office work in something like LibreOffice. We live in a day and age where smartphones have become very integrated into society. If all you do is use a web browser, you're probably better off using your phone, a device that doesn't nearly require as much space and as much power. The HP Compact is a x86 computer, but imagine today if you were to go use your phone, which is probably running ARM-based architecture, especially if you're using some newer Android phones or iPhones. But I think one thing that's also really important is to put the age of hardware as well as physical size into perspective. The HP Compact is big. It requires 2 hands for me to lift it, and it needs to be rested on a firm, flat surface. Now, I could technically hold it with 1 hand, but I'm not that jacked. Don't worry, you can wait in line later, ladies. I'm available. But things like my Asus E403NA is a device that is much more powerful than the HP Compact and is also a fraction of the size. I'm still able to run some lower-end video games, and I can even run all the games that I just mentioned, like Psychonauts and Cuphead, all work great on the E403NA. And another thing to think about too is that so many people in today's day and age don't actually own computers. They only use their phones. And I don't think it will be a crime to tell somebody to just use their phone, especially if they're not technically savvy themselves. Most modern smartphones do things worse than computers, obviously, like tinkering and gaming. But when it comes to what people actually do, I think phones will get the job done for most people. You might have problems using something like, like your Only Office or Google Docs, for example, but Otherwise, I think phones are pretty capable of doing what the vast majority of people need to do. Now, considering that you've made it this far, and you're still watching the video and haven't paused the video to leave an angry comment down below, I think an important thing here is presenting guidelines to how we can understand how we use technology better. We need our devices to receive updates, and when they aren't, it means we need to start making the move to newer devices that will. And yes, while Linux has a lot of options that can save older or low-end hardware, it's the slow decline of hardware that will work against us, and the limits that are set in place purely because older hardware can't keep up with software that's constantly changing. Maintaining hardware has its cost. It's a cost for the developers who have to keep it functional, or on you because parts not be available, or the programs you use might not work. But also a real environmental cost when modern products might be a better alternative. Heck, even using your phone might be a better alternative. But at the end of the day, I'm not really here to tell you what to do, because everyone's situation is different and it's all about what works for you. I'm not going to hunt you down because you still have a Debian computer running on Apple's PowerPC or any of that. It's all about making smart decisions about how we use the tools that we have to the best of our disposal. And speaking of the things that you could use the best at your disposal, you could put your engagement to good use by smashing that like button. If you hit that like button, you can watch more footage of me attempt to play Psychonauts at 5 FPS. You can also visit my website, Trafotin.com, in the description and get a transcript of this entire video. So if you're more interested in reading the video instead, you can go to my website in the description and read it instead. And if you're interested in supporting the work that I do, as always, you can give me money on Patreon, YouTube memberships, or through cryptocurrency. So thank you for watching. I will see you guys next time, and have a great rest of your week. Hopefully not on an Intel Core 2 Duo.